Chapter 1 of The Creatures That Time Forgot by Ray Bradbury. Mad, impossible world, sun blasted by day, cold racked by night, and life condensed by radiation into 8 days. Sim eyed the ship. If he only dared reach it and escape. But it was more than half an hour distant, the limit of life itself. Chapter 1. During the night, Sim was born. He lay wailing upon the cold cave stones. His blood beat through him 1,000 pulses each minute. He grew steadily. Into his mouth his mother with feverish hands put the food. The nightmare of living was begun. Almost instantly at birth his eyes grew alert, and then, without half understanding why, filled with bright, insistent terror. He gagged upon the food, choked and wailed. He looked about blindly. There was a thick fog. It cleared. The outlines of the cave appeared, and a man loomed up, insane and wild and terrible. A man with a dying face, old, withered by winds, baked like adobe in the heat. The man was crouched in a far corner of the cave, his eyes whitening to one side of his face, listening to the far wind trumpeting up above on the frozen night planet. Sim's mother, trembling now and again, staring at the man, fed Sim pebble fruits, valley grasses, and ice nipples, broken from the cavern entrances, and eating, eliminating, eating again, he grew larger, larger. The man in the corner of the cave was his father. The man's eyes were all that was alive in his face. He held a crude stone dagger in his withered hands, and his jaw hung loose and senseless. Then, with a widening focus, Sim saw the old people sitting in the tunnel beyond this living quarter. And as he watched, they began to die. Their agonies filled the cave. They melted like waxen images. Their faces collapsed inward on their sharp bones. Their teeth protruded. 1 minute their faces were mature, fairly smooth, alive, electric. The next minute, a desiccation and burning away of their flesh occurred. Sim thrashed in his mother's grasp. She held him. "No, no," she soothed him quietly, earnestly, looking to see if this too would cause her husband to rise again. With a soft, swift padding of naked feet, Sim's father ran across the cave. Sim's mother screamed. Sim felt himself torn loose from her grasp. He fell upon the stones, rolling, shrieking with his new, moist lungs. The webbed face of his father jerked over him. The knife was poised. It was like one of those prenatal nightmares he had had while still in his mother's flesh. In the next few blazing, impossible instants, questions flicked through his brain. The knife was high, suspended, ready to destroy him. But the whole question of life in this cave, the dying people, the withering and the insanity, surged through Sim's new small head. How was it that he understood? A newborn child. Can a newborn child think, see, understand, interpret? No, it was wrong. It was impossible. Yet it was happening. To him. He had been alive an hour now, and in the next instant, perhaps dead. His mother flung herself upon the back of his father and beat down the weapon. Sim caught the terrific backwash of emotion from both their conflicting minds. "Let me kill him!" shouted the father, breathing harshly, sobbingly. "What has he to live for?" "No, no!" insisted the mother, and her body, frail and old as it was, stretched across the huge body of the father, tearing at his weapon. "He must live. There may be a future for him. He may live longer than us and be young." The father fell back against a stone crib. Lying there, staring, eyes glittering, Sim saw another figure inside that stone crib. A girl child, quietly feeding itself, moving its delicate hands to procure food. His sister. The mother wrenched the dagger from her husband's grasp. stood up, weeping and pushing back her cloud of stiffening gray hair. Her mouth trembled and jerked. "I'll kill you," she said, glaring down at her husband. "Leave my children alone." The old man spat tiredly, bitterly, and looked vacantly into the stone crib at the little girl. "1/8 of her life's over already," he gasped, "and she doesn't know it. What's the use?" As Sim watched, his own mother seemed to shift and take a tortured, smoke-like form. The thin, bony face broke out into a maze of wrinkles. She was shaken with pain and had to sit by him, shuddering and cuddling the knife to her shriveled breasts. She, like the old people in the tunnel, was aging, dying. Sim cried steadily. Everywhere he looked was horror. A mind came to meet his own. Instinctively, he glanced toward the stone crib. Dark, his sister, returned his glance. Their minds brushed like straying fingers. He relaxed somewhat. He began to learn. The father sighed, shut his lids down over his green eyes. "Feed the child," he said exhaustedly. "Hurry. It is almost dawn, and it is our last day of living, woman. Feed him. Make him grow." Sim quieted, and images out of the terror floated to him. This was a planet next to the sun. The nights burned with cold. The days were like torches of fire. It was a violent, impossible world. The people lived in the cliffs to escape the incredible ice and the day of flame. Only at dawn and sunset was the air breath-sweet, flower-strong, and then the cave peoples brought their children out into a stony, barren valley. At dawn, the ice thawed into creeks and rivers. At sunset, the day fires died and cooled. In the intervals of even, livable temperature, the people lived, ran, played, loved, free of the caverns. All life on the planet jumped, burst into life. Plants grew instantly. Birds were flung like pellets across the sky. Smaller-legged animal life rushed frantically through the rocks. Everything tried to get its living down in the brief hour of respite. It was an unbearable planet. Sim understood this, a matter of hours after birth. Racial memory bloomed in him. He would live his entire life in the caves, with 2 hours a day outside. Here, in stone channels of air, he would talk incessantly with his people, sleep never, think, and lie upon his back, dreaming, but never sleeping. And he would live exactly 8 days. The violence of this thought evacuated his bowels. 8 days. 8 short days. It was wrong, impossible, but a fact. Even while in his mother's flesh, some racial knowledge had told him he was being formed rapidly, shaped, and propelled out swiftly. Birth was quick as a knife. Childhood was over in a flash. Adolescence was a sheet of lightning. Manhood was a dream. Maturity a myth. Old age, an inescapably quick reality. Death, a swift certainty. 8 days from now he'd stand half-blind, withering, dying, as his father now stood, staring uselessly at his own wife and child. This day was an 1/8 part of his total life. He must enjoy every second of it. He must search his parents' thoughts for knowledge, because in a few hours they'd be dead. This was so impossibly unfair. Was this all of life? In his prenatal state, hadn't he dreamed of long lives, valleys not of blasted stone, but green foliage and temperate clime? Yes! And if he had dreamed, then there must be truth in the visions. How could he seek and find the long life? Where? And how could he accomplish a life mission, that huge and depressing, in 8 short days? How had his people gotten into such a condition? As if at a button pressed, he saw an image. Metal seeds, blown across space from a distant green world, fighting with long flames, crashing on this bleak planet. From their shattered hulls tumbled men and women. When? Long ago. 10,000 days. The crash victims hid in the cliffs from the sun. Fire, ice, and floods washed away the wreckage of the huge metal seeds. The victims were shaped and beaten like iron upon a forge. Solar radiations drenched them. Their pulses quickened. 200, 500, 1,000 beats a minute. Their skins thickened. Their blood changed. Old age came rushing. Children were born in the caves. Swifter, swifter, swifter the process. Like all this world's wildlife, the men and women from the crash lived and died in a week, leaving children to do likewise. So this is life, thought Sim. It was not spoken in his mind, for he knew no words. He knew only images. Old memory, an awareness, a telepathy that could penetrate flesh, rock, metal. So I'm the 5,000th in a long line of futile sons. What can I do to save myself from dying 8 days from now? Is there escape? His eyes widened. Another image came to focus. Beyond this valley of cliffs, on a low mountain, lay a perfect, unscarred metal seed. A metal ship, not rusted or touched by the avalanches. The ship was deserted, whole, intact. It was the only ship of all these that had crashed that was still a unit, still usable. But it was so far away. There was no one in it to help. This ship, on the far side of the mountain, was the destiny toward which he would grow. There was his only hope of escape. His mind flexed. In this cliff, deep down in a confinement of solitude, worked a handful of scientists. To these men, when he was old enough and wise enough, he must go. They too dreamed of escape, of long life, of green valleys and temperate weathers. They too stared longingly at that distant ship upon its high mountain, its metal so perfect it did not rust or age. The cliff groaned. Sim's father lifted his eroded, lifeless face. "Dawn's coming," he said. End of Chapter 1. Chapters 2 and 3 of The Creatures That Time Forgot by Ray Bradbury. Morning relaxed the mighty granite cliff muscles. It was the time of the avalanche. The tunnels echoed to running bare feet. Adults, children, pushed with eager, hungry eyes toward the outside dawn. From far out, Sim heard a rumble of rock, a scream, a silence. Avalanches fell into valley. Stones that had been biding their time, not quite ready to fall for 1,000,000 years, let go their bulks. And where they had begun their journey as single boulders, they smashed upon the valley floor in 1,000 shrapnels and friction-heated nuggets. Every morning at least one person was caught in the downpour. The cliff people dared the avalanches. It added one more excitement to their lives, already too short, too headlong, too dangerous. Sim felt himself seized up by his father. He was carried brusquely down the tunnel for 1,000 yards to where the daylight appeared. There was a shining, insane light in his father's eyes. Sim could not move. He sensed what was going to happen. Behind his father, his mother hurried, bringing with her the little sister, Dark. "Wait! Be careful!" she cried to her husband. Sim felt his father crouch, listening. High on the cliff was a tremor, a shivering. "Now!" bellowed his father and leaped out. An avalanche fell down at them. Sim had accelerated impressions of plunging walls, dust, confusion. His mother screamed. There was a jolting, a plunging. With one last step, Sim's father hurried him forward into the day. The avalanche thundered behind him. The mouth of the cave where Mother and Dark stood back out of the way was choked with rubble and 2 boulders that weighed 100 pounds each. The storm thunder of the avalanche passed away to a trickle of sand. Sim's father burst out into laughter. "Made it! By the gods! Made it alive!" And he looked scornfully at the cliff and spat. "Pah!" Mother and Sister Dark struggled through the rubble. She cursed her husband. "Fool! You might have killed Sim."
"I may yet," retorted the father.
Sim was not listening. He was fascinated with the remains of an avalanche in front of the next tunnel. A blood stain trickled out from under a rise of boulders, soaking into the ground. There was nothing else to be seen. Someone else had lost the game. Dark ran ahead on lithe, supple feet, naked and certain. The valley air was like a wine filtered between mountains. The heaven was a restive blue, not the pale, scorched atmosphere of full day, nor the bloated, bruised black purple of night, a riot with sickly, shining stars. This was a tide pool, a place where waves of varying and violent temperatures struck, receded. Now the tide pool was quiet, cool, and its life moved abroad. Laughter. Far away, Sim heard it. Why laughter? How could any of his people find time for laughing? Perhaps later he would discover why. The valley suddenly blushed with impulsive color. Plant life, thawing in the precipitant dawn, shoved out from most unexpected sources. It flowed as you watched. Pale green tendrils appeared on scoured rocks. Seconds later, ripe globes of fruit twitched upon the blade tips. Father gave Sim over to Mother and harvested the momentary volatile crop, thrust scarlet, blue, yellow fruits into a fur sack which hung at his waist. Mother tugged at the moist new grasses, laid them on Sim's tongue. His senses were being honed to a fine edge. He stored knowledge thirstily. He understood love, marriage, customs, anger, pity, rage, selfishness, shadings and subtleties, realities and reflections. One thing suggested another. The sight of green plant life whirled his mind like a gyroscope, seeking balance in a world where lack of time for explanations made a mind seek and interpret on its own. The soft burden of food gave him knowledge of his system, of energy, of movement. Like a bird newly cracking its way from a shell, he was almost a unit, complete, all-knowing. Heredity had done all this for him. He grew excited with his ability. They walked, Mother, Father, and the two children, smelling the smells, watching the birds bounce from wall to wall of the valley like scurrying pebbles. And suddenly the father said a strange thing.
"Remember?"
Remember what? Sim lay cradled. Was it any effort for them to remember when they'd lived only 7 days? The husband and wife looked at each other. "Was it only 3 days ago?" said the woman, her body shaking, her eyes closing to think. "I can't believe it. It is so unfair." She sobbed, then drew her hand across her face and bit her parched lips. The wind played at her gray hair. "Now it is my turn to cry. An hour ago it was you."
"An hour is half a life."
"Come." She took her husband's arm. "Let us look at everything, because it will be our last looking."
"The sun'll be up in a few minutes," said the old man. "We must turn back now."
"Just one more moment," pleaded the woman.
"The sun will catch us."
"Let it catch me, then."
"You don't mean that."
"I mean nothing, nothing at all," cried the woman. The sun was coming fast. The green in the valley burnt away. Searing wind blasted from over the cliffs. Far away where sunbolts hammered battlements of cliff, the huge stone faces shook their contents. Those avalanches not already powdered down were now released and fell like mantles.
"Dark!"
shouted the father. The girl sprang over the warm floor of the valley, answering, her hair a black flag behind her. Hands full of green fruits, she joined them. The sun rimmed the horizon with flame, the air convulsed dangerously with it, and whistled. The cave people bolted, shouting, picking up their fallen children, bearing vast loads of fruit and grass with them back to their deep hideouts. In moments, the valley was bare, except for one small child someone had forgotten. He was running far out on the flatness, but he was not strong enough, and the engulfing heat was drifting down from the cliffs even as he was half across the valley. Flowers were burnt into effigies, grasses sucked back into rocks like singed snakes. Flower seeds whirled and fell in the sudden furnace blast of wind, sown far into gullies and crannies, ready to blossom at sunset tonight, and then go to seed and die again. Sim's father watched that child running, alone, out on the floor of the valley. He and his wife and Dark and Sim were safe in the mouth of their tunnel.
"He'll never make it," said Father. "Do not watch him, woman. It is not a good thing to watch."
They turned away, all except Sim, whose eyes had caught a glint of metal far away. His heart hammered in him, and his eyes blurred. Far away, atop a low mountain, one of those metal seeds from space reflected a dazzling ripple of light. It was like one of his intra-embryo dreams fulfilled. A metal space seed, intact, undamaged, lying on a mountain. There was his future. There was his hope for survival. There was where he would go in a few days, when he was, strange thought, a grown man. The sun plunged into the valley like molten lava. The little running child screamed. The sun burned, and the screaming stopped. Sim's mother walked painfully, with sudden age, down the tunnel, paused, reached up, broke off 2 last icicles that had formed during the night. She handed one to her husband, kept the other. "We will drink one last toast, to you, to the children."
"To you," he nodded to her. "To the children."
They lifted the icicles. The warmth melted the ice down into their thirsty mouths. All day the sun seemed to blaze and erupt into the valley. Sim could not see it, but the vivid pictorials in his parents' minds were sufficient evidence of the nature of the day fire. The light ran like mercury, sizzling and roasting the caves, poking inward, but never penetrating deeply enough. It lighted the caves. It made the hollows of the cliff comfortably warm. Sim fought to keep his parents young, but no matter how hard he fought with mind and image, they became like mummies before him. His father seemed to dissolve from one stage of oldness to another. "This is what will happen to me soon," thought Sim in terror. Sim grew upon himself. He felt the digestive, eliminatory movements of his body. He was fed every minute. He was continually swallowing, feeding. He began to fit words to images and processes. Such a word was love. It was not an abstraction, but a process, a stir of breath, a smell of morning air, a flutter of heart, the curve of arm holding him, the look in the suspended face of his mother. He saw the processes, then searched behind her suspended face, and there was the word in her brain ready to use. His throat prepared to speak. Life was pushing him, rushing him along toward oblivion. He sensed the expansion of his fingernails, the adjustments of his cells, the profusion of his hair, the multiplication of his bones and sinew, the grooving of the soft pale wax of his brain at birth as clear as a circle of ice, innocent, unmarked, was an instant later, as if hit with a thrown rock, cracked and marked, and patterned in a million crevices of thought and discovery. His sister Dark ran in and out with other little hothouse children, forever eating. His mother trembled over him, not eating. She had no appetite. Her eyes were webbed shut.
"Sunset,"
said his father at last. The day was over. The light faded. A wind sounded. His mother arose.
"I want to see the outside world once more. Just once more."
She stared blindly, shivering. His father's eyes were shut. He lay against the wall.
"I cannot rise,"
he whispered faintly.
"I cannot." "Dark,"
the mother croaked. The girl came running.
"Here."
And Sim was handed to the girl.
"Hold to Sim, Dark. Feed him. Care for him."
She gave Sim one last fondling touch. Dark said not a word, holding Sim, her great green eyes shining wetly.
"Go now," said the mother. "Take him out into the sunset time. Enjoy yourselves. Pick foods, eat, play."
Dark walked away without looking back. Sim twisted in her grasp, looking over her shoulder with unbelieving, tragic eyes. He cried out and somehow summoned from his lips the first word of his existence.
"Why?"
He saw his mother stiffen.
"The child spoke."
"Aye," said his father.
"Did you hear what he said?" "I heard," said the mother quietly.
The last thing Sim saw of his living parents was his mother, weakly, swayingly, slowly moving across the floor to lie beside her silent husband. That was the last time he ever saw them move. End of chapters 2 and 3. Chapters 4 and 5 of The Creatures That Time Forgot by Ray Bradbury. The night came and passed and then started the next day. The bodies of all those who had died during the night were carried in a funeral procession to the top of a small hill. The procession was long, the bodies numerous. Dark walked in the process, holding the newly walking Sim by one hand. Only an hour before dawn, Sim had learned to walk. At the top of the hill, Sim saw once again the far-off metal seed. Nobody ever looked at it or spoke of it. Why? Was there some reason? Was it a mirage? Why did they not run toward it, worship it, try to get to it, and fly away into space? The funeral words were spoken. The bodies were placed upon the ground where the sun, in a few minutes, would cremate them. The procession then turned and ran down the hill, eager to have their few minutes of free time running and playing and laughing in the sweet air. Dark and Sim, chattering like birds, feeding among the rocks, exchanged what they knew of life. He was in his second day, she in her third. They were driven, as always, by the mercurial speed of their lives. Another piece of his life opened wide. 50 young men ran down from the cliffs, holding sharp stones and rock daggers in their thick hands. Shouting, they ran off toward distant black, low lines of small rock cliffs.
"War!"
The thought stood in Sim's brain. It shocked and beat at him. These men were running to fight, to kill, over there in those small black cliffs where other people lived. But why? Wasn't life short enough without fighting, killing? From a great distance he heard the sound of conflict, and it made his stomach cold. Why, Dark? Why? Dark didn't know. Perhaps they would understand tomorrow. Now there was the business of eating to sustain and support their lives. Watching Dark was like seeing a lizard forever flickering its pink tongue, forever hungry. Pale children ran on all sides of them. One beetle-like boy scuttled up the rocks, knocking Sim aside to take from him a particularly luscious red berry he had found growing under an outcrop. The child ate hastily of the fruit before Sim could gain his feet. Then Sim hurled himself unsteadily. The two of them fell in a ridiculous jumble, rolling, until Dark pried them squalling apart. Sim bled. A part of him stood off like a god and said, "This should not be. Children should not be this way. It is wrong." Dark slapped the little intruding boy away.
"Get on," she
cried.
"What's your name, bad one?"
"Cheon," laughed the boy.
"Cheon, Cheon, Cheon."
Sim glared at him with all the ferocity in his small, unskilled features. He choked. This was his enemy. It was as if he had waited for an enemy of person as well as scene. He had already understood the avalanches, the heat, the cold, the shortness of life. But these were things of places, of scene. Mute, extravagant manifestations of unthinking nature, not motivated save by gravity and radiation. Here now, in this stridulent Cheon, he recognized a thinking enemy. Cheon darted off, turned at a distance, tauntingly crying,
"Tomorrow I will be big enough to kill you,"
and he vanished around a rock. More children ran, giggling by Sim. Which of them would be friends, enemies? How could friends and enemies come about in this impossible quick lifetime? There was no time to make either, was there? Dark, as if knowing his thoughts, drew him away. As they searched for desired foods, she whispered fiercely in his ear.
Enemies are made over things like stolen foods. Gifts of long grasses make friends. Enemies come, too, from opinions and thoughts. In 5 seconds, you've made an enemy for life. Life's so short, enemies must be made quickly.
And she laughed with an irony strange for one so young, who was growing older before her rightful time.
You must fight to protect yourself. Others, superstitious ones, will try killing you. There is a belief, a ridiculous belief, that if one kills another, the murderer partakes of life energy of the slain, and therefore will live an extra day. You see, as long as that is believed, you're in danger.
But Sim was not listening. Bursting from a flock of delicate girls who tomorrow would be tall, quieter, and who day after that would gain breasts and the next day take husbands, Sim caught sight of one girl whose hair was a violet-blue flame. She ran past, brushing Sim. Their bodies touched. Her eyes, white as silver coins, shone at him. He knew then that he had found a friend, a love, a wife, one who'd a week from now lie with him atop the funeral pyre as sunlight undressed their flesh from bone. Only the glance, but it held them in mid-motion 1 instant.
Your name,
he shouted after her.
Light,
she called laughingly back.
I'm Sim,
he answered, confused and bewildered.
Sim,
she repeated it, flashing on.
I'll remember.
Dark nudged his ribs.
Here, eat,
she said to the distracted boy.
Eat or you'll never get big enough to catch her.
From nowhere, Cheon appeared, running by.
Light,
he mocked, dancing malevolently along and away.
Light, I'll remember your light, too.
Dark stood tall and Reed slender, shaking her dark ebony clouds of hair sadly.
I see your life before you, little Sim. You'll need weapons soon to fight for this light one. Now hurry, the sun's coming.
They ran back to the caves. 1/4 of his life was over. Babyhood was gone. He was now a young boy. Wild rains lashed the valley at nightfall. He watched new river channels cut in the valley, out past the mountain of the metal seed. He stored the knowledge for later use. Each night there was a new river, a bed newly cut.
What's beyond the valley?
Wondered Sim.
No one's ever been beyond it, explained Dark. All who tried to reach the plain were frozen to death or burnt. The only land we know's within half an hour's run. Half an hour out and half an hour back. No one has ever reached the metal seed then, Dark scoffed. The scientists, they try, silly fools. They don't know enough to stop. It's no use. It's too far. The scientists. The word stirred him. He had almost forgotten the vision he had short hours after birth. His voice was eager. Where are the scientists? He demanded. Dark looked away from him. I wouldn't tell you if I knew. They'd kill you, experimenting. I don't want you joining them. Live your life. Don't cut it in half trying to reach that silly metal thing on the mountain. I'll find out where they are from someone else then. No one will tell you. They hate the scientists. You'll have to find them on your own, and then what? Will you save us? Yes, save us, little boy. Her face was sullen. Already half her life was gone. Her breasts were beginning to shape. Tomorrow she must divine how best to live her youth, her love. And she knew no way to fully plumb the depths of passion in so short of space. We can't sit and talk and eat, he protested, and nothing else. There's always love, she retorted acidly. It helps one forget. Gods, yes. She spat it out. Love. Sim ran through the tunnels, seeking. Sometimes he half imagined where the scientists were. But then a flood of angry thought from those around him, when he asked the direction to the scientist's cave, washed over him in confusion and resentment. After all, it was the scientist's fault that they had been placed upon this terrible world.
Sim flinched under the bombardment of oaths and curses. Quietly, he took his seat in a central chamber with the children to listen to the grown men talk. This was the time of education, the time of talking. No matter how he chafed at delay, or how great his impatience, even though life slipped fast from him and death approached like a black meteor, he knew his mind needed knowledge. Tonight, then, was the night of school. But he sat uneasily. Only 5 more days of life. Cheon sat across from Sim, his thin-mouthed face arrogant. Light appeared between the two. The last few hours had made her firmer-footed, gentler, taller. Her hair shone brighter. She smiled as she sat beside Sim, ignoring Cheon, and Cheon became rigid at this and ceased eating. The dialogue crackled, filled the room, swift as heartbeats, 1,000, 2,000 words a minute. Sim learned, his head filled. He did not shut his eyes, but lapsed into a kind of dreaming that was almost intra-embryotic in lassitude and drowsy vividness. In the faint background the words were spoken, and they wove a tapestry of knowledge in his head. He dreamed of green meadows free of stones, all grass, round and rolling and rushing easily toward a dawn with no taint of freezing, merciless cold or smell of boiled rock or scorched monument. He walked across the green meadow. Overhead the metal seeds flew by in a heaven that was a steady, even temperature. Things were slow, slow, slow. Birds lingered upon gigantic trees that took 100, 200, 5,000 days to grow. Everything remained in its place. The birds did not flicker nervously at a hint of sun, nor did the trees suck back frightenedly when a ray of sunlight poured over them. In this dream people strolled. They rarely ran. The heart rhythm of them was evenly languid, not jerking and insane. Their kisses were long and lingering, not the parched mouthings and twitchings of lovers who had 8 days to live. The grass remained, and did not burn away in torches. The dream people talked always of tomorrow and living and not tomorrow and dying. It all seemed so familiar that when Sim felt someone take his hand, he thought it simply another part of the dream. Light's hand lay inside his own. "Dreaming?" she asked. "Yes. Things are balanced, our minds, to even things, to balance the unfairness of our living, go back in on ourselves, to find what there is that is good to see." He beat his hand against the stone floor again and again. "It does not make things fair. I hate it. It reminds me that there is something better, something I have missed. Why can't we be ignorant? Why can't we live and die without knowing that this is an abnormal living?" And his breath rushed harshly from his half-open, constricted mouth. "There is purpose in everything," said Light. "This gives us purpose, makes us work, plan, try to find a way." His eyes were hot emeralds in his face. "I walked up a hill of grass, very slowly," he said. "The same hill of grass I walked an hour ago?" asked Light. "Perhaps. Close enough to it. The dream is better than the reality." He flexed his eyes, narrowed them. "I watched people, and they did not eat. Or talk? Or talk either. And we are always eating, always talking. Sometimes those people in the dream sprawled with their eyes shut, not moving a muscle." As Light stared down into his face, a terrible thing happened. He imagined her face blackening, wrinkling, twisting into knots of agedness. The hair blew out like snow about her ears. The eyes were like discolored coins caught in a web of lashes. Her teeth sank away from her lips. The delicate fingers hung like charred twigs from her atrophied wrists. Her beauty was consumed and wasted, even as he watched. And when he seized her in terror, he cried out, for he imagined his own hand corroded, and he choked back a cry. "Sim, what's wrong?" The saliva in his mouth dried at the taste of the words. 5 more days. "The scientists," Sim started. Who'd spoken? In the dim light, a tall man talked. "The scientists crashed us on this world, and now we have wasted thousands of lives and time. It's no use, it's no use. Tolerate them, but give them none of your time. You only live once, remember." Where were these hated scientists? Now, after the learning, the time of talking, he was ready to find them. Now at least he knew enough to begin his fight for freedom. For the ship.
"Sim, where are you going?"
But Sim was gone. The echo of his running feet died away down a shaft of polished stone. It seemed that half the night was wasted. He blundered into a dozen dead ends. Many times he was attacked by the insane young men who wanted his life energy. Their superstitious ravings echoed after him. The gashes of their hungry fingernails covered his body. He found what he was looking for. A half-dozen men gathered in a small basalt cave, deep down in the cliff lode. On a table before them lay objects which, though unfamiliar, struck harmonious chords in Sim. The scientists worked in sets, old men doing important work, young men learning, asking questions. And at their feet were 3 small children. They were a process. Every 8 days there was an entirely new set of scientists working on any one problem. The amount of work done was terribly inadequate. They grew old, fell dead just when they were beginning their creative period. The creative time of any one individual was perhaps a matter of 12 hours out of his entire span. 3/4 of one's life was spent learning, a brief interval of creative power, then senility, insanity, death. The men turned as Sim entered.
"Don't tell me we have a recruit," said the eldest of them.
"I don't believe it," said another, younger one. "Chase him away. He's probably one of those warmongers."
No,
objected the elder one, moving with little shuffles of his bare feet toward Sim.
Come in, boy."
He had friendly eyes, slow eyes, unlike those of the swift inhabitants of the upper caves. Gray and quiet.
"What do you want?"
Sim hesitated, lowered his head, unable to meet the quiet, gentle gaze.
"I want to live,"
he whispered. The old man laughed quietly. He touched Sim's shoulder.
"Are you a new breed? Are you sick?"
he queried of Sim, half seriously.
"Why aren't you playing? Why aren't you readying yourself for the time of love and marriage and children? Don't you know that tomorrow night you'll be an adolescent? Don't you realize that if you are not careful, you'll miss all of life?"
He stopped. Sim moved his eyes back and forth with each query. He blinked at the instruments on the tabletop.
"Shouldn't I be here?"
he asked, naively.
"Certainly," roared the old man sternly. "But it's a miracle you are. We've had no volunteers from the rank and file for 1,000 days. We've had to breed our own scientists. A closed unit. Count us. 6. 6 men and 3 children. Are we not overwhelming?"
The old man spat upon the stone floor.
"We ask for volunteers and the people shout back at us. Get someone else or we have no time." And you know why they say that?
"No."
Sim flinched.
"Because they're selfish. They'd like to live longer, yes, but they know that anything they do cannot possibly ensure their own lives any extra time. It might guarantee longer life to some future offspring of theirs, but they won't give up their love, their brief youth, give up one interval of sunset or sunrise."
Sim leaned against the table earnestly.
"I understand."
"You do?"
The old man stared at him blindly. He sighed and slapped the child's thigh gently.
"Yes, of course you do. It's too much to expect anyone to understand any more. You're rare."
The others moved in around Sim and the old man.
"I am Dink. Tomorrow night court here will be in my place. I'll be dead by then. And the night after that someone else will be in court's place. And then you, if you work and believe. But first I give you a chance. Return to your playmates if you want. There is someone you love? Return to her. Life is short. Why should you care for the unborn to come? You have a right to youth. Go now if you want, because if you stay you'll have no time for anything but working and growing old and dying at your work. But it is good work. Well?" Sim looked at the tunnel. From a distance the wind roared and blew. The smells of cooking and the patter of naked feet sounded, and the laughter of lovers was an increasingly good thing to hear. He shook his head impatiently, and his eyes were wet. "I will stay," he said. End of chapters 4 and 5. Chapter 6 of The Creatures That Time Forgot by Ray Bradbury. The third night and third day passed. It was the fourth night. Sim was drawn into their living. He learned about that metal seed upon the top of the far mountain. He heard of the original seeds, things called ships, that crashed, and how the survivors hid and dug in the cliffs, grew old swiftly, and in their scrabbling to barely survive, forgot all science. Knowledge of mechanical things had no chance of survival in such a volcanic civilization. There was only now for each human. Yesterday didn't matter. Tomorrow stared them vividly in their very faces. But somehow the radiations that had forced their aging had also induced a kind of telepathic communication whereby philosophies and impressions were absorbed by the newborn. Racial memory, growing instinctively, preserved memories of another time. "Why don't we go to that ship on the mountain?" asked Sim. "It is too far. We would need protection from the sun," explained Dink.
"Have you tried to make protection?"
"Salves and ointments, suits of stone and birdwing, and, recently, crude metals, none of which worked. In 10,000 more lifetimes perhaps we'll have made a metal in which will flow cool water to protect us on the march to the ship. But we work so slowly, so blindly. This morning, mature, I took up my instruments. Tomorrow, dying, I lay them down. What can one man do in one day? If we had 10,000 men, the problem would be solved."
"I will go to the ship," said Sim.
"Then you will die,"
said the old man. A silence had fallen on the room at Sim's words. Then the men stared at Sim. "You are a very selfish boy."
"Selfish," cried Sim resentfully.
The old man patted the air.
"Selfish in a way I like. You want to live longer. You will do anything for that. You will try for the ship. But I tell you it is useless. Yet if you want to, I cannot stop you. At least you will not be like those among us who go to war for an extra few days of life."
"War?" asked Sim. "How can there be war here?" And a shudder ran through him. He did not understand.
"Tomorrow will be time enough for that," said Dink. "Listen to me now."
The night passed. End of chapter 6.